Dyssynchrony and reverse triggering, breast stacking. So this kind of complication of mechanical ventilation which have been ignored for many years and which I think are frequent and potentially important. These are my conflict of interest, and I'll start by saying we know relatively little about patient ventilator synchrony. We have been started to look at that not so long ago, and the more we look at it, the more we see things which we have difficulties to interpret. So what we know is that in general, patients who have a lot of patient ventilator dysynchrony or asynchrony have a poor outcome. The group of Luis Blanc in Spain with Bob Kaczmarek showed that it was associated with higher mortality even after adjusting for severity of outcome. And we have a number of studies showing it's associated with longer duration of mechanical ventilation. Specifically for ineffective efforts, a group of Georgopoulos showed that when the ineffective efforts appear as in cluster, so they define cluster as a period of time where you have more than 30 ineffective efforts over a 3-minute period. This is again strongly associated with longer duration of ventilation, longer ICU stay. Very nice study. So patients having a lot of asynchrony have poor outcome. The field of hypoxemic patients and patients with high respiratory drive is of particular interest because we know how important are the settings of mechanical ventilation. And with dysynchrony, you may have something very different happening compared to what you set and what you expected on the ventilator. So very often we see, we have described dysynchrony in hypoxemic patients like being the result of insufficient assistance from the vent, so generating double triggering, breast stacking, and short cycles. The general principle is that the patient's inspiratory drive is high, the inspiratory time on the ventilator is short, and the total inspiratory neural time, if you wish, is longer than patient's inspiration. And then you have either this strange wave shape on the flow, there is no real peak expiratory flow, or there is kind of M shape, or there is a double triggering because the patient's effort is longer than the insufflation time and it triggers a second breath. Why is it especially frequent in hypoxemic patients? First, because they have a high drive to breathe, and second also because these are really the patients where we use small tidal volume, short inspiratory time, and this nice study by Rich Caleb showed that the smaller the tidal volume you use, the higher the incidence of this problem, and they calculated that patients was having high worker breathing under the ventilator when the tidal volume were smaller. And of course you have seen these tracings where patients are supposed to be treated with 6 ml per kilogram, but repeatedly they receive 12 ml because there is a double triggering, or even 18 ml per kilogram because they trigger 3 breaths at a time. And of course, if we think that the strict lung protective ventilation is important, that will completely false the picture. However, things are a little bit more complicated because this is not simply related to high drive, insufficient assistance. And we may have at least the same problem, and probably more frequent problem, with excessive sedation. I will try to show you and show through some preliminary result that this phenomenon is probably very frequent. Indeed, with excessive sedation, the brain has a little control over the breathing pattern, and there is a reflex phenomenon which can happen, which we call the reverse triggering or respiratory entrainment when it's very regular, which can also cause breast stacking and short cycles. So this is an illustration where you see, I hope you see well here tracings of double triggering. So you see this is a square flow in volume control, and we have superimposed the EDI tracing, indicating the activity of the diaphragm, on the two airway pressure curve. And you see that the first airway pressure curve is not patient-triggered. There is no electrical activity of the diaphragm. It's the ventilator insufflation which triggers the diaphragm contraction through a mechanism which we don't understand very well. So every time the EDI activity triggers the second breath. And this is a patient who is deeply sedated. The patient looks like being on controlled ventilation, but he received twice the ventilation you have set on the ventilator. In fact, we described this as initially a phenomenon which was completely unrecognized, and our first observation was really an accidental observation. This was a patient on pressure control ventilation, and we wanted to detect early on the electrical activity of the diaphragm. And as you can see, there is no indication here that the patient is triggering the ventilator, and the rate is very regular. If we change the rate, we will just see that the patient is still well ventilated. But when we put an electrical activity, when we measure the electrical activity of the diaphragm, our surprise was to see that at every breath, there was a diaphragmatic contraction starting approximately in the middle of the breath. So the patient was not triggering the ventilator. And again, when we change the rate on the ventilator, the rate of the diaphragmatic contraction had exactly the same change. But it was triggered by the mechanical insufflation, again by a mechanism which we don't know. And you see, it's very difficult to detect, because the only way would be to say, well, maybe there is some curvature on the pressure curve, but again, this is very difficult to detect. What are the consequences of this reverse triggering? Well, it could be tidal volume increase, especially in pressure control. So you see the pattern here is different in these patients. It's every other breath. So you see at the beginning of the breath there is an increase in the esophageal pressure, like a passive insufflation, and then there is this abrupt contraction. The next breath it's only passive. The following breath it's again passive and active contraction. And you can see on the tidal volume there is an increase in tidal volume at every reverse triggered breath. Of course, it could also, like a patient with high drive, it could induce breath stacking. And you see a nice example where you have a lot of double cycles, which are not double triggering in the classical way, because the first breath is a time cycle. It's a mechanical breath not triggered by the patient. And so this is very confusing for the clinician, because again, these patients are very heavily sedated. And I'd like to show you two preliminary results of observational studies we are conducting now to try to better understand this phenomenon. The first study is a study where we want to understand when patients under mechanical ventilation start using their diaphragm. So the study is about diaphragm activity or diaphragm inactivity under mechanical ventilation. And to do that, we put an electrical activity catheter at the time of intubation. So we want to pick up the first time the patient starts breathing after intubation. This is not ARDS, this is all comers who are going to be ventilated for at least 24 hours. And this is just an example. Maybe it's hard to see, sorry for the slide. So this is first day, this fully controlled mechanical ventilation. This is the placement of the EDI catheter, which from the ECG tracing indicates that it's in the good position. But of course we see no electrical activity, and this is the trends for the first 12 hours after intubation. The scale is very indicates very, very low activity. This is 5 microvolt of EDI, and we say it starts to be a substantial activity when it's at least above 5. So for the 12 first hours, there is almost no activity of the diaphragm. The second day it's the same. You see the catheter is still in the good position, but the EDI activity is also very, very low. So this patient is still not using the diaphragm. It's only at the end of the third day that you see an increase in the activity of the diaphragm above 5 microvolt. But when you look here, and again maybe difficult to see, this activity looks quite strange. On day 4, the patient seems to be using the diaphragm much more, but so the patient is off sedation, he has still some hydromorphone on board, but you see that every breath every activity of the diaphragm is in fact reverse triggering. So the first 3 days there is no activity. The first day where the patient starts using the diaphragm, it's purely reverse triggering. And it's only day 5 that the patient is normally breathing and triggering the ventilator. This is a surprise because we see a lot of these patients and we don't know the consequences. Maybe it's very injurious for the diaphragm to have this inactivity followed by periods of eccentric contraction of the diaphragm. So this may be a frequent cause of diaphragm weakness. And when we look at the incidence of reverse triggering, this is 25 patients who were on assist control the first day. We look at every breath during the recordings, and we found that almost all patients had a little bit or very frequent reverse triggering. And on average, you see that if we think that having more 10% of the breath as reverse triggered breath is high, you have 40% of the patients with more than 10% of their breath the first day of assist control being reverse triggered breath. So this is a very, very frequent phenomenon which may be of concern. The second study is just ongoing. It's an observational study in ARDS this time because we think it's a particular concern in ARDS. So it's called the breathing effort in ARDS, the BEARD study. And we have daily recordings from patients from day 1 of ventilation to day 7 of either esophageal pressure or EDI. And just again, I have no numbers to show you, just a few recordings. We see a lot of patients like that. You see again this phenomenon of double triggering. And when you look at the esophageal pressure curve, the second one, it's very clear that this is a mechanical insufflation followed by an abrupt contraction, which is again reverse triggering because these patients are sedated. You see that sometimes the effort may be huge, again triggering 3 breaths at a time. And also when it's not doing double triggering, this is a different patient, you see that the peak of the electrical activity, or sorry, here the esophageal pressure, the peak is right in the middle of the expiration, which means that at the time the muscle, the diaphragm is lengthening, there is a contraction. This is what is called eccentric contraction, and it's a potential source of injury for any muscle. So this may be a source of diaphragmatic weakness, which we find so often in these patients. So in conclusion, I wanted to say this is a phenomenon we are just discovering, which is very frequent, which is potentially injurious, and which I think needs more work. In addition, and I will finish on this slide, this is a major source of noise in randomized control trials in ARDS. This is the last trial published in the JAMA comparing high PEEP to low PEEP. And you may have heard the negative result of the study showing harmful effect of high PEEP. There was nothing about synchrony during the trial, but some investigators, and especially Marcelo Amato, did some recordings on their patients using the protocol. And he found, and there is a series of recordings, a lot of this dyssynchrony. So you see example of double breath in patients ventilated with PEEP. And one hypothesis is that, of course, if this incidence of double triggering and breast stacking is the same in the two arms, it may be even much more harmful in the high PEEP arm, because you go to very high tidal volume. So this is noise in the trials, and I think this is definitely something which we need to solve for the next 5 years. Thank you very much.